So something we know very well is that we Jews are very different. Even internally, we saw that Kohanim were different than the Nevi'im, were different than Israelites. And these differences strengthened our people, and we learned, and then we adopted the ways of holiness of the Kohanim. A difference can be seen as a strength. A society that acknowledges differences as a source of strength, as something that expands the society, that increases the culture, that brings more music and art and literature and science and medicine, and sees differences as a strength, is of course a much stronger society. America has always been seen as a country that recognizes and acknowledges and welcomes different cultures. The fact that difference now has in many areas been seen as almost the enemy or something to be nervous about or worried about is weakening our society. The fact is, we are a different people. It's been used against us. We're in the month of Adar 1, Adar 2, so we're talking about Purim. Haman's accusation against the Jews that we're different. And he thought that in itself was enough to see the Jews as a threat. Ahasuerus agreed. He didn't know that he was talking about Jews, but he didn't like different. And he thought that different meant confrontation. So Haman says, they don't obey your laws, which wasn't true, but difference, it made sense to Ahasuerus. The different, they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of our Persian Empire. We do things differently. We're different in America. We're different from American secular society for sure. Starting with reading and writing from right to left, to the way we usher in our new year, right? The American New Year is ushered in with New Year resolutions. We usher in our New Year by repenting for our sins. It's ushered in a bit by partying and drinking in the secular society. We do the opposite. We usher in our New Year by fasting. Interestingly enough, the calendar this past month shows us another example of just how different we Jews are. This month we marked some anniversaries. One of the anniversaries was the death of Ilan Ramon. Remember him, the Israeli astronaut who died in the explosion on the Columbia back in 2003, along with his crewmates. In the secular world, we celebrated President's Day, focused mainly on Washington and Lincoln. But the idea was to salute our giants, our presidents, by celebrating their birthdays. That's an American tradition because it's a Christian tradition to celebrate birthdays. And this is founded as a Protestant country or by Protestants. So the most sacred days in the Christian calendar, we've seen it. We already saw Ash Wednesday. Many Catholic neighbors were wearing the ash on their forehead. It's going to be Christmas and Easter, and it focuses on birthday. And I know Easter is seen as, this is the death of Jesus. No, it's not. It's the resurrection. So it's birth and birth, not birth and death. They're not marking the earth site. That's Good Friday. They're marking the resurrection. We Jews have our giants, and all of them have birthdays as well. But interesting enough, there's no day on our calendar dedicated to any of those birthdays. We don't celebrate, we don't mark birthdays. We celebrate them, but we don't make them part of our history. This month was the birthday of the greatest giant our people has ever known. A week ago on the Hebrew calendar was the 7th day of Adar, Moses' birthday. How many of you knew that last Monday was Moses' birthday? Good, a few of you knew. It was on your calendars, right? It does say so in the Luach. It's Moses' birthday. So you had a party? You got a cake? No, not really. That's okay. Not only don't we have any celebrations of birth, but quite the contrary, our tradition went in the very opposite direction. Our Torah reading this morning, as you saw, was Tetzaveh. All in all, not one of the more interesting Torah portion. There are no stories. A few mitzvot, as I mentioned, but only connected with the temple, not relevant in our day and age. But our rabbis noticed something remarkable about this Torah portion, which makes it famous. It is the one that does not contain the name of Moshe. Moses does not appear. From the time of Moses' birth, at the beginning of the book of his Exodus, all the way to the last chapter of Deuteronomy, when he passes away, every single Torah reading has the name Moshe, except this one. And this is the Torah reading that every year comes out by design. In which week? The week Moses' birthday falls. It's an amazing coincidence. Each year on the week in which Moses' birthday falls, we read a Torah portion where he goes completely unmentioned, as if the rabbis wanted him forgotten in terms of the birth. Now, obviously, things don't happen by chance in terms of the Torah. There's always, for the rabbis, a deeper lesson involved. And there's one in this. According to the rabbis, to the sages of the Talmud, God kept Moses' name out of the Torah portion in order, in a sense, to fulfill an expressed wish of Moses himself. Remember that awesome moment in the life of Moses, the day when he stood on the top of Mount Sinai, ready to bring down the 2 tablets of the law. And what happened? The moment his back was turned, while he's still on top of the mountain, receiving the 10 Commandments, the people betray him. They build the golden calf. That's next week's Torah reading, although it already happened. It's, Ein Mukdav Ve'Muchar. There is no chronology in the Torah. They built the golden calf. They danced around it, singing Chag Ladonai Machar. Tomorrow, a festival to God. This is your God, O Israel. So God is furious. He says to Moses, I'm going to destroy this people, and I will make a new nation for you. What an offer, right? Think of it. God's offering Moses the spotlight forever. He's promising to make Moses like Romulus or George Washington, the father of a great nation. It will all start with you, God says to Moses. What does Moses say, and what does he do? He turns to God and says, if you don't forgive their sin, blot me out from the book you have written. Purge me from your Torah. Remove my name from the history books. Let it never be known that I ever walked the face of this earth. Rather, what I want you to do is save this people. And so our rabbis say, in order to symbolically fulfill this demand of Moses, God chose to leave his name out of this morning's Torah portion. Now, obviously, in the modern period, we look at it different, because who created the Torah portions? It wasn't God, it was the rabbis. The rabbis purposely created a Torah portion that left out Moses' name. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, once pointed out, the classic heroes of old sought their own personal aggrandizement. They wanted to make sure that their name would be remembered, so they did everything humanly possible to glorify their own names. Alexander the Great wanted all children to be named Alexander, and he had cities named for himself. Romulus, he took all of Rome. The entire empire took his name. The first calendar was referred to as the Julian calendar, after Julius Caesar. That's the way it was with all the classical heroes, to spread their name, but not Moses. Except for a place called Moses, New Mexico, which I found on Google. I can't think of any other place that carries his name. Even in Israel, think about it, you've all traveled in Israel. There are streets named for everyone. King Saul, King George, every hero of the early period of Zionism. I've never come across one named for the greatest hero of all. And I looked in, on a map I had, and I looked for street names in Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv. I had those maps. Not one. Not one named Rehov Moshe, Moses' street. Indeed, on the very week that his birthday takes place, our tradition, in keeping with the character of Moses, leaves his name unmentioned. That was Moses. He didn't seek the spotlight. He was prepared to withdraw from that spotlight to benefit his people. He wanted to do right simply because it was right. He was willing to sacrifice his own good for the well-being of the community. So how different would our world be today if we had leaders that would do the same as Moses? We look at leaders around the world. I was reading just about the leader of North Korea, who's getting himself back in the spotlight. He is the single biggest buyer of Hennessy cognac in the world. That's a good fact to know in case you're ever, doing trivia. The biggest buyer of Hennessy cognac. His people are starving, literally. He dines on lobster with silver chopsticks. And the wines are flown in from Paris. Why France is allowing that is a different question. So that's the leader of a country? How did he get the job? Well, he succeeded his father. How much better off his country would be, how much better off the world would be if their leaders remembered Moses, if they remembered Jewish tradition, which teaches Ezehu Gibor, who is a real hero, Hakovesh et Yisro, he who can conquer his own self-inclinations, his own self-aggrandizement, he who makes sure that the people take precedence over his own name. We mentioned George Washington. George Washington, there's a lot of reasons he's a hero, but to me, his most heroic act is when he said, I'm not the king. I'm not the emperor. He accepted Mr. President. That's the most he would take. And when they wanted to make him president for life, he says, excuse me, I'm going home. There's no president for life. I'm done. Go have an election. That was the most important thing he did. He just left the limelight like that. He could have been king, could have been president for life. He knew that that would not be good for the people, so he walked away. So many leaders today insist on stepping forward and stepping on their own people to elevate themselves. Moses insisted on stepping back when he thought he could save his people. I mentioned the yahrzeit this month of Ilan Ramon, the astronaut who lost his life in the Columbia disaster. He understood and lived by this lesson. The way he died in that explosion, with millions, literally millions of people in horror were watching, including his own family, leaving a wife widowed, children fatherless. A father who said, just looked and said, I lost my son. I lost my son. Ilan Ramon's greatness was not for what he symbolized, but for who he himself was. Nothing better tells who he was than that one moment in his life. And it wasn't the famous moments. He talked of putting a mezuzah on the space shuttle. We all heard about it, very proud. He insisted on keeping kosher while in space because he says, I'm in the limelight. I have to live as an observant Jew. It wasn't even when he took along a picture that survived the Holocaust or when he recited Shema Yisrael from outer space every time he passed over Jerusalem. All those are moments we will never forget. They are forever emblazoned in our hearts. But there was another moment, a moment less publicized, a moment that couldn't come out until years later when it was declassified. More than 20 years before, when he flew over Iraq. We now know that Ilan was one of the pilots of the 8 Israeli jets that destroyed Iraq's nuclear reactor on June 17th, 1981. It tells us volumes about his remarkable abilities when we discover he was the only one of the pilots who had no operational combat experience because he was so young. He was the youngest of the pilots. Israel's major general at the time, Amos Yadlin, a veteran of the mission, recalled that while preparing for the Iraqi mission, Ilan noted that his parents were Holocaust survivors. And he said, as he was trying to convince them to take him, lacking his actual combat experience and how young he was, if I can prevent a second Holocaust, I will gladly sacrifice my life for this. Yadlin said Ilan was a cool-headed, modest, sort of humble hero, not like most macho Top Gun flyers. Usually we saw the movie Top Gun. You're supposed to be macho to be Top Gun. It's supposed to be something that is good for you. But he says that wasn't Elon. But the story gets better. You see, the 8 F-16 fighter jets, each of which was to drop a 1-ton bomb on the reactor, they were not allowed, they couldn't refuel in midair because the attack took place in the middle of the night, and none of the Arab countries could know what was going on or allow them to refuel. Everything would have to go just perfect for them to have enough fuel to be able to return to Israel. And the greatest threat was to the 8th jet, the one that would fly last. Why? Because by the time the 8th jet was there to drop a bomb, all of the Iraqi defenses were on. They were alerted to it. They now knew what was happening. The easiest one was the first jet or two. The 8th jet was almost suicidal because it wasn't a surprise anymore. In Yadlin's words, our assessment while preparing for the attack was that 1 or 2 of the last planes would probably not make it back. Who was to fly that last vulnerable jet? Ilan Ramon volunteered, and this was the argument he offered. I'm not married. I don't have kids. The other pilots do. I'm the 8th jet. As simple as that. No one argued with him. He became the 8th jet, and he survived. Ilan Ramon was not Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't George Washington. We're not going to have a day on the Jewish calendar to remind us of this man other than his yahrzeit. But that would not have been important to him under any circumstance, because he lived by those words, who is a real hero? The one who conquers his own inclinations. The one who does the right thing, even if no one knows, even if it's not in his own best interest. The one who does the right thing simply because it's right. So Ilan Ramon was like a Moses, the one who placed the interest of his people over his own self. He personified that spirit in our day and age. We do get caught up in hearing about the infighting in Israel's political leaders. We witnessed it for a year before October 7th, and it was pretty terrifying. It was vicious infighting. Everybody trying to elevate themselves into a position of power and influence. And many blame that discord for the lack of preparation when October 7th hit. But Ilan Ramon comes to remind us that there are countless Israelis we don't know, we've never heard their names, who on a daily basis place the interests of their country before their own. Literally, hundreds of thousands went to war to put an end to this threat from Hamas. Each one of them is a silent hero. The stories of men and women in the reserves who grabbed their weapons, put on the uniforms, ran to the front before they even got their assignments. They hadn't even been called up yet, and they were already at the front line fighting the battle. The number of heroes since October 7th has been so great that we can't even gather all the stories, and none of them care if their stories are ever told. They didn't do it for fame. They did it to rescue fellow Israelis, put an end to the attack, and protect the country. Maimonides tells us that every person has the capability of becoming a Moses, and that was, of course, his name, Moses Maimonides. It seems quite a stretch to believe that each and every one of us has the capability of doing what the Torah tells us Moses did. He saw the face of God. He was the greatest prophet ever. But I do think Maimonides is correct. We all have the capability of being like a Moses, who the Torah describes as the most humble of all people. So Moses had a choice, he or his people. His name would live on, or his people would live on. He chose to perpetuate his people, and so his name did live on. But we don't celebrate his birthday. Every week in which his birthday falls, our Torah portions make sure that we remember him by his absence, and he's absent from one other very famous book. Second to the Bible, what is the most read and used Jewish piece of literature? The Haggadah. In the English, you'll find his name. It's not in the Hebrew. Moses' name is left completely out of the Haggadah to remind us once again the hero was God, not Moshe. We remember Ilan Ramon by his absence as well. We remember those who were murdered on October 7th and those who have died fighting to make sure it never happens again. Moses, we are told, died not like a normal human way, but rather from a kiss by God and then is buried by God. Ilan Ramon did not die in a normal manner either. He died closer to God, poetically, than any other human being. That's a great way to be remembered. And those who have perished in Israel from October 7th to this very day in defense of the Jewish state are right up there with Moshe and Ilan Ramon, for they lived for their people. They died for their people. They're all Jewish heroes, and may their souls be bound up in the bonds of life eternal. Shabbat Shalom.